What's up guys, welcome to the far side. So the Mandalorian Season 3 Episode 2 is now out and we're here to break it down. Lots to talk about this episode, so let's dive right in. The very first thing worth discussing is a recap of the episode where the armor is having a conversation with Mando about bo-katan Kryze, and yes, this is a very bo-katan centric episode. We'll discuss more about that in a second. So she says that bo-katan once ruled Mandalore by her claim of bloodline and the Darksaber, but eventually ended in disaster because she lost her way and basically cursed Mandalore in the process, alluding to her not really earning the Darksaber to begin with. We get a lot of this story beats in here where most of the Mandalorian mysticism, or at least superstition in the eyes of the mainstream Mandalorians, are not at all what they seem but may have been rooted in something concrete and real. The Darksaber, for example, seems to have some form of power that it should be earned in a duel, otherwise something bad will happen, and like how it is so heavy for Din because of some internal conflict that the weapon senses. Which brings a lot of questions to the table. Obviously, it's the opposite of a lightsaber in that this is the absence of light. Is the Kyber crystal native to Mandalore like Beskar? Does it have a Kyber crystal at all, or is it something else? They also talk about a Mandalorian prophecy, which I appreciate as a mirror to the Chosen One for the Skywalker saga. We'll talk more about that towards later scenes to make sense of it all. But overall, I get that they're leaning into the Mandalorian society like they would the Jedi, with similar prophecies, different factions in the Jedi and the Sith vying for control, much like religious zealots of the Watch and the New Mandalorians, etc. And I also like how that expands Star Wars to something other than Jedi and Sith. Of course it is, and forever will be that main thing for Star Wars, but on top of that we're exploring another side to the galaxy, and it is refreshing. Anyway, we first see Pelli Motto talking shop with a customer having his speeder repaired, and we see her swindle him out of some credits, saying she'd have to order the parts in the mid-rim. Being Tatooine, of course, they're in the outer rim territories, a public holiday much like New Year with all fireworks and the celebrations going on. It's also a reference to the Bunta Eve pod races from Episode 1, Phantom Menace, where the 9-year-old Anakin, the only human able to compete, won, gaining his freedom, leading him to a path with the Jedi Order with the help of Qui-Gon Jinn. See speeders racing on the streets, which is a far cry from the spectacle of the pod races, but at least some form of it continues during the event. By the way, she's talking to a Rodian, Greedo species from A New Hope, as you remember, the one Han shot, and yes, he did fire first, because he's a badass.
Sorry about the mess.
This Rodian looks loaded, right? Just with the way he's dressed, and eventually concedes to paying more than what's necessary. Sure enough, once the guy steps off the shop, Jawas come out and turns out they've stripped the speeder to make it look like the parts are missing, and she pays them off for the con. And I get it, they're in Mos Eisley, so scum and villainy is kind of commonplace, so I guess nobody told that guy. So Mando arrives. Remember, he's looking for a replacement part for IG-11's memory circuit, and the reason for that, as he explains here, is that he needs a droid to check the radiation levels before he himself, which makes sense. The prevailing knowledge is that the world has been poisoned during the purge and still high concentrations of radiation. So he's on his N1 starfighter all pimped out. We'll love that thing. Baby Yoda jumps out to Pelli Motto, showing a little bit of skill with the Force, now becoming more and more like Yoda was able to do in the prequel trilogies, no doubt a result of his training with Luke. So she asks Mando if the Hutts are back, referencing to the twins we saw or not in the Book of Boba Fett, and if he's taking on Boba Fett, which might be her low-key saying she doesn't like that dude. Also, I'm not sure if did she just clown Boba Fett from being fat.
You checking out Boba Fett?
It has been noted how different the physique is from the OG Boba to the latest version in the show. He's played by the older Temuera Morrison, who played the character in Attack of the Clones. So if we ever get season 2, I hope the twins return and we get a underworld war kind of situation in Tatooine. And I just really want to forget the Power Rangers biker gang thing.
Yes.
So Mando looks for the memory circuit they need for IG-11, but unfortunately the Jawas don't have the part, so Pelli Motto sells him on the R5 astromech droid. This might be the actual R5-D4 from A New Hope, with the malfunctioning motivator Ben and Luke almost got instead of R2-D2. He might just be the resident astromech for the series going forward, which I would be fine with, although not put together all that well from what we're told. I'm not sure what they're doing with the IG-11 storyline. They just dropped it really hard. Anyway, she reattaches the droid port for R5 and Mando goes straight to Mandalore. As they approach the planet, he tells Grogu about the planets within the Mandalore system, and also he grew up in Mandalore's moon of Concordia, leading me to believe that the entire Children of the Watch survived the Night of 1,000 Tears by being on that moon during the Purge. This place has been depicted in other shows and has a storied history, which is a whole nother video, but he continues that every Mandalorian can trace their roots back to this planet, referencing of course to Mandalore. It's really cool to note that being a Mandalorian Mandalorian doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a certain species. It's not about that, it's the belief system, the way of life, pretty much like the Jedi and the Sith. As the N1 starfighter enters the atmosphere, the tension builds a little as it passes a storm and rain splatters across and strong winds stress on the hull, and when it finally passes, you see some of the most beautiful shots in the entire show. I mean, the wide shot of Mandalore's surface was really great. We see the scars of the purge, the entire landscape below has been destroyed, crystallized by the radiation, and craters litter the landscape as a reminder of how evil the Empire is. So after they land, R5 was tasked to scout on ahead and check for levels of radiation within the mines, but this appears on Mando's radar. So pressurizing the ship and his suit, he goes to check on the astromech droid. At this point, we see the ruins of the city structure under the surface. As Din gaze at the once prosperous civilization, a group of Alamite creatures attack him. Later, we learn from bo-katan that these were native to the planet but lived away from the Mandalorian population centers, preferring desolate parts of the planet instead. Mando loses his blaster and then has to resort to using the darksaber to fend them off, but he still has trouble keeping it up. To be fair, he was fairly tired just coming from a long trip from Tatooine, so let's cut him some slack. But with extreme difficulty, he was able to push through to defeat the creatures. Mando and R5, who was incapacitated by the Alamites, returned to the ship to look at the results of the scan, then learned that the area is actually breathable, meaning the radiation levels are pretty low or non-existent, and that Mandalore is not cursed as they originally thought. So bo-katan was actually right all along. So Din and Grogu, who has his levitation thing, drops down into the city, going past ruined buildings, structures down to where the mines would have been. As they go past the bones of a once prosperous metropolis, it gives us a sense of how much the Mandalorians have lost. Mando walks the path towards the mines and sees an old Mandalorian helmet in the ground, half buried in the dirt. So as he examines the helmet, huge claws pop out of the ground to encase him and its metallic embrace, and a huge crab-like cyborg emerges from underneath the ground. We see this to be partially organic, as we are shown an eye encased within its shell. I really love the post-apocalyptic vibe to this thing. It's really dark, dirty, and menacing. What's more is that the entire thing turns out to be an exoskeleton armor, a spindly General Grievous looking kind of thing. It has some spines and tubes sticking out here and there, but basically as well we see it's just a brain inside of there. We've seen tech like this before. Half organic flesh, half robotic parts are prevalent in Star Wars. The closest would be, as I said, is General Grievous. Maul was another example, post episode 1 of course. This thing is so good and I don't need to know what it is, but we can assume that this would have been a product of the Purge, a species maybe trying to live off of remnants and the indigenous creatures. We do see it trying to get Mando's blood later on. In any case, Grogu tries to help Mando with the Force but wasn't able to open the cage. Mando tells him to go back to bo-katan because she knows the place. Back on Kalevala, bo-katan sees Mando's ship and confronts him to tell him to, f off because she's busy moping in her chair, but she finds out it's baby Yoda. It's a good thing a speechless 50-year-old baby and a worn-out astromech droid understood each other enough to get there. She's able to determine what happened by checking the logs, so they head to her ship. The Gauntlet, which is a super cool ship, it's not depicted all that well, but this is a large ship and also used as a transport. As they arrived in Mandalore, bo-katan says that it wasn't always like this. As I said, this is a very bo-katan centric episode. We see her here reluctantly return to her homeworld. Remember, unlike Mando, who's never been to the planet before, she ruled here, called it her home, and remembers how it was before being destroyed. He says this was once a beautiful city, but now it was just a tomb. We're also shown her knowledge of Mandalore itself as she quickly realizes a bunch of Alamites and preemptively shoots at them. We also see how proficient she is with her array of Mandalorian weapons as she takes all of them down and tells baby Yoda that his dad wasn't the only Mandalorian. They arrive at the lair where the cyborg creature proceeds to pump life juice from Mando, and she proceeds to fight the creature and ends up taking the darksaber in a way that might just be mirrored from Luke pulling the lightsaber out of the snow. I do have some thoughts about this in as far as the darksaber needs to be earned for them to wield it, and I'm not entirely sure about this, but by saving Mando's life here, wouldn't she be able to have claim to the sword now? Also, the way she easily wields it as opposed to Din kind of adds to this tier. I'm not discounting Mando altogether, but going back to the scene, bo-katan slices through the Mad Max wannabe android with ease, just like Anakin and Obi-Wan through waves of combat droids in the Clone Wars. As she approached Mando, believing the thing to be dead, its head crawls away, only to return inside the gigantic droid, which now when I think about it, kind of looks like a version of a crab droid from the Clone Wars. Then she takes it down, which also kind of reminds me of how Obi-Wan did that creature from Geonosis, starting with its legs, then eventually with that fatal blow to the head. After the fight, Mando wakes up with bo-katan making soup that Din has never eaten before that turns out to be traditional Mandalorian soup. It's like we're being shown two sides of what being a Mandalorian is that are totally opposite from one another. And when Mando shows her how, to him at least, how important the creed is, she kind of thinks about that and maybe she's inspired by this. Hard to say at this point. Later, she discusses how the tragedy that has befallen them was really caused by their infighting, which the Empire uses to ultimately destroy them, referencing the inherent nature of any militant-centric society. So she decides to help him reach the mines and tell him that she too had to recite the tenets being part of the ruling clan of Mandalore, but it was more of a formality, spectacle for the benefit of the people kind of thing. And Din says that he would have wanted to meet her father. She responds that he died defending Mandalore. As a sign of respect for the fallen warrior, Din says this is the way. And at that moment, there seems to be some connection between them, and I'm sure a lot of people will be shipping them now, but aside from that, it makes sense to merge these two sides of Mandalorians together, which can serve as the bridge towards a united future for all Mandalorians, but we'll just have to wait to find out. So they arrive at the living waters of Mandalore. It's dark and gritty and mysterious. She goes ahead and reads this is the place of the great Mythosaur that Mandalore the Great was able to tame. This also kind of mirrors the Arthurian legends where the king, in this case Mandalore the Great, will return and herald a new age of Mandalore when a Mandalorian is able to ride this mythical beast. Mandalore the Great, I think, is the amalgamation of Legends version of Mandalore, Mandalore the Indomitable, and Mandalore the Ultimate, specifically riding atop a basilisk war droid leading his warriors to conquer entire systems. Yeah, Legends Mandalorians are actual conquerors, often against the Old Republic and the Jedi. In any case, in canon, the figure has been shrouded in mystery, only known as an ancient ruler leading his people and rides an ancient creature, the image of which has been the Mandalorian symbol ever since. So Din walks to the water reciting the creed, renewing his vows, so to speak. We see bo-katan kind of impressed with this, with Din's faith in the way, but then abruptly falls down, weighed down by his armor. So bo-katan, knowing how deep the water is, quickly puts on her helmet and dives in to save him, igniting her jetpack to catch up. She finds him at the bottom and drags him upwards towards the surface when the surrounding rocks move, revealing huge eyes and the unmistakable form of the ancient Mythosaur staring back at them. And then the episode ends when they finally land and we see her in shock of the discovery. The creature exists within the bowels of the planet, turns out, which would mean reclaiming the throne is within her grasp. All she has to do is tame an ancient mountain-sized creature, no problem. She can then regain the respect of her people and maybe rebuild what they lost, but I don't think it would be that easy. Now, it's important to say that most ancient creatures in Star Wars lore tend to be force sensitive, or at least connected to the force in a very significant way. I mean, it flows through everything, but some more than others. And this time I can kind of see Grogu helping them out with his connection, so he has something to do in this season. But in all seriousness, the force seems to be connected to the Mandalorians more than they realize, and I'm really curious where they're going with the prophecy thing. Hope they lean into that. As it stands, the leadership amongst the Mandalorians are still up for grabs, and who knows, we might see that pivotal shift become the reunification of the Mandalorian race in Mandalore. And there's something to be said about Bo and Din becoming that bridge, like she would wield a sword and he tames the Mythosaur, or vice versa. There's a lot of cool things in this episode, and I'm really glad they're continuing world building and taking it in interesting directions. Needless to say, that Mythosaur reveal at the end is the icing on the cake, and it really got people hooked, eagerly waiting for the next chapter. Let me know your thoughts on the episode and theories on what may happen next. Like and subscribe if you like this content. Thank you so much for watching. Take care out there, and see you in the next one.